Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I'm Carrie Oderman with UATV. Since 2014, Ukraine has greatly progressed in its fight against corruption. A new institutional framework was established and anti-corruption instruments were launched. The Revolution of Dignity made anti-corruption policy a priority in Ukraine. This past election strengthened that mandate. President Zelensky's political campaign built on the idea of reforms. What should we be watching for? To talk more about this, we welcome to our studio Anton Marchuk, an expert from the Center of Policy and Legal Reform. Thank you, Mr. Marchuk, and thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure for me.
Just yesterday, on July 24th, during the conference called the New Anti-Corruption Strategy for Ukraine, experts met. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, first of all, I want to mention that since the beginning of 2018, Ukraine has no anti-corruption strategy at all. The previous one was implemented, and the new one was developed by the National Agency for Prevention of Corruption. It's a specialized anti-corruption body, but unfortunately it was not adopted by the parliament because the quality of this draft strategy was not so high, and there were many mistakes and certain weak points in that draft strategy. Therefore, we, as a Center of Policy and Legal Reform, we decided to develop an alternative anti-corruption strategy, and we presented it yesterday. And we discussed this draft strategy with our colleagues from international organizations, from donor institutions, from certain political parties, and from presidential office.
Many international groups are interested in the reform process in Ukraine. Could you tell our viewers which organizations and NGOs are involved in this process?
We prepared our draft strategy mainly with the expert of our center, but we also have certain meetings with Transparency International Ukraine, Together Against Corruption Initiative, and certain other NGOs. And we, of course, discussed some of our ideas with our colleagues from European Union Anti-Corruption Initiative. We also presented this draft strategy for donors, for example, for UNDP, European Union Anti-Corruption Initiative, USAID projects, and certain other institutions.
Was it necessary to develop a completely new anti-corruption strategy, or were you able to take parts of the one that was developed in 2018?
I believe that we should make the main point of anti-corruption strategy on prevention, and of course we need to take a look on issues with punishment for corruption. The previous strategy was not cohesive and not comprehensive one. Therefore, we decided to develop absolutely new document based on different analysis, research in the area of anti-corruption. We decided to take a close look on the state of implementation of the previous anti-corruption strategy and decided to prepare absolutely new document.
Okay, the Cabinet of Ministers had already prepared something, and if I'm not mistaken, there was a draft law on anti-corruption strategy for 2018-2020. How did they receive your suggestions, and will they integrate them into their already existing ideas?
I believe that absolutely new draft law would be submitted by the presidential administration, because during the last meeting of the National Council on Anti-Corruption Policy, where the president was participated as well, the deputy head of presidential office, Ruslan Rabashapka, pointed that anti-corruption strategy, absolutely new anti-corruption strategy, is one of the priorities in the area of anti-corruption policy for the next half a year.
Let's take a step back and explain to people exactly how you define corruption, though. We're always talking about what corruption is. A simple definition could be anything where you personally receive an advantage. Is that a safe way of describing corruption? How do you describe corruption?
Yeah. To say simply, I believe that corruption must have two main points. The first one is abuse of power by public official, and the second important element is illegal gain, illegal benefit for the same official or for any other person.
So what are the key ways to prevent corruption in Ukraine? What are some of the no-fail ideas?
We believe that comprehensive approach and holistic approach is necessary, and we believe that not only specific tools like electronic declaration for public official is necessary or conflict of interest regulations are necessary, but we also believe that in certain areas corruption risks should be eliminated through comprehensive reforms in such areas. For example, we believe that corruption in judiciary could be eliminated only through a comprehensive reform just in the area of judiciary. For example, through reload of judicial governance bodies like High Qualification Commission of Judges or High Council of Justice. We also believe that the same approach should be undertaken in terms of prosecution office. And we also believe that, for example, in terms of prevention corruption in state-owned enterprises, the best way to prevent corruption is to sell all the state-owned enterprises that are not necessary for the state. And we believe that in such way of comprehensive reform, I mean that both structural reform and both specific anti-corruption reform could give us a necessary result.
Now, we are just coming off a major election where the servant of the people, President Zelensky's party, won huge gains. They definitely have a mandate, and he himself and his party have been campaigning a lot on anti-corruption. As you and I both know, campaign does not always translate to policy.
Yes.
What have you seen as an expert on this topic in these early beginnings of the organization of the party and his policy, Zelensky's policy? What steps are being taken towards anti-corruption?
Okay, now I'm quite optimistic because certain steps by President Zelensky before the elections, parliamentary elections, they were necessary in terms of anti-corruption policy. For example, President Zelensky made a necessary step to ensure effective international cooperation of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau with specialized anti-corruption bodies, law enforcement agencies from other countries, because this issue hasn't been resolved since 2015. And just now, only in May of 2019, President Zelensky, when he came to power, he resolved this issue. We also heard certain progressive initiatives from the Servant of People Party. I mean, for example, civil forfeiture of assets of public officials, which could not be explained by official income of public official. It's also a progressive practice, and we can find such a practice, for example, in Great Britain, where so-called unexplained wealth orders is quite effective against corruption. And I believe that if we will see in September or October these initiatives as draft laws, and if these draft laws would be supported, I believe that it would be a strong and positive sign that the political view of President Zelensky and his political party in terms of anti-corruption policy is really strong, and we could have a good chance to make some progressive steps in this area.
There are some conflicts in what Zelensky was campaigning on, however. He's promoting economic growth in Ukraine. Ukraine is known for notoriously low salaries, but this motivates this motivates companies to come to Ukraine and use the well-educated workforce. Yes. Now, one of the problems with corruption is the low salaries. How can he manage both, raising the salaries and preventing corruption?
I believe that higher salaries for public officials is an inevitable step, and it is necessary because it is difficult to promote anti-corruption steps in the company or in a public institution where people with low salaries should think about their life, about their families, how to buy food or how to find money for utility or something like that. And of course, it would be necessary, but how such step could be ensured in practice, it's a good question. Unfortunately, we do not have such a great budget to ensure such high salaries. But, for example, the practice of so-called directorates in certain ministries where experts on reforms have much higher salaries, I believe it's a good example which could be multiplied for other state institutions.
You mentioned the experience of the UK was copied in some areas, but the United Kingdom and the Ukraine maybe don't have that much in common when it comes to corruption. Are there other post-Soviet states that might have gone through the same thing a little bit earlier than Ukraine? Who can we use as a model in the neighborhood in Ukraine?
Unfortunately, I do not think that we can consider any post-Soviet state as a comprehensive model, that we can just copy any model and to implement it in Ukraine. But I believe that certain steps from other not only post-Soviet countries, but the countries of former socialistic group, I mean Romania or Poland, they also implemented successful anti-corruption reform. For example, in Romania, punishment for corruption was ensured in previous years, and the functioning of the National Anti-Corruption Directorate was quite successful story, and it was recognized by the European Union. And a Ukrainian model of specialized anti-corruption institution is quite similar with the Romanian one. And I believe that, for example, Romanian experience could be useful for Ukraine. Maybe some steps from Georgia also could be necessary for Ukraine in terms of fighting with so-called small corruption in administrative services or in healthcare or in education.
The Office of the President recently released a quote talking about how they're in favor of a new anti-corruption package. You've basically come up with one. How do you plan on cooperating with them? Has the President's office shown enthusiasm with your results, and how will they take it forward?
As I know, just yesterday, Deputy Head of Presidential Office, Ruslan Rabashapka, he mentioned that anti-corruption strategy is necessary for Ukraine. He said certain comments on our draft strategy, for example, that much more attention should be paid to digitalization and to certain areas like state-owned enterprises or prevention of corruption in defense sector. These areas are covered in our draft, but maybe we can propose more steps in these areas. I believe that we can, in collaboration with the Presidential Office, to improve our draft strategy, and it could be submitted by the Presidential Office to the Parliament. We are in communication with them, and we are just trying to find the best way how to improve this draft strategy and to make it really comprehensive, and how to include in this draft strategy steps that could lead Ukraine to success in the fight against corruption.
How could anti-corruption legislation be seen as a litmus test for the new parliament? If it's brought in early and it's passed quickly and easily, would you consider that a good indication of the direction Ukraine is heading?
Yeah, as I said before, I believe that submission of necessary draft laws by the President Zelensky in September or maybe in October in the area of anti-corruption, and the swift consideration by the Parliament, swift adoption of these draft laws would be a good sign, and could be a strong sign of political will to fight against corruption.
And finally, would you say that Ukraine has come a long way, or that they still have a long way to go?
I would say that we both have already implemented comprehensive anti-corruption reform. We have already achieved a lot in fight against corruption, but unfortunately we also have to ensure necessary steps in terms of prevention of corruption and in terms of ensuring punishment and sanctions for corruption, because unfortunately, despite many steps, we have not achieved the final goal yet.
That was Anton Marchuk, an expert at the Center of Policy and Legal Reform. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned with UATV.